Hi, my name's Keith Cooper, and in this video I'm going to look at my black and white print workflow. What does that mean? It means the entire process from thinking about taking a picture to making a black and white print. Now, I've been asked about this by quite a lot of people, how I go about it, and I've been looking at how my own approach to this has changed over, let's say, the last 20 years of digital photography. That covers pretty much most of what people will regard as digital photography. It does go back a bit further, but for myself, I started serious photography in about 2003. That's when I became a professional photographer. The camera I was using at the time was a Canon 1DS, a full frame camera. Unique at the time, a glorious 11 megapixels, but perfectly good enough for making some great pictures and lots of great prints as well. So how does it change over time? And more to the point, what hasn't changed? And what new tools are there that I might consider as part of my workflow? Now, I'll come back to the new tools later on in the video, but I'm going to go through the basic principles which have not really changed that much. Computers have changed, software has changed, but the basic principles of it have not changed that much. First of all, it starts with the scene, and I'm talking here mostly about landscape photography. It's an area I do get commissioned to do it, but I rarely get lots of commissions to do landscape photography. I've done lots of videos about the business side of photography, which includes selling prints and things like that, if you're interested in stuff like that. But do have a look as well at the Northlight Images website, because I've been writing articles there for nigh on 20 years, whereas the videos only go back till August 2020. So there's many more articles than there are videos. But, pick whatever you like. Oh, and please do subscribe to the channel. I have to remember to say that, but it is appreciated. Anyway, the scene. First of all, looking at somewhere, is there a print in it? Am I taking this photo as a record of somewhere I went, as a nice view that I like to, or am I taking it potentially because I think there's a print in it? Now, you don't always know this, but it does help, certainly for larger prints, to consider that actually I'm taking this for a print. The biggest consideration is lighting. Now, obviously I take the pictures in colour, I use raw files, but I have to think, is this a good black and white image? Now, if I'm not sure, I'll take the picture anyway, because I have come across pictures where I was unsure at the time when I took them, but when I got back, when I started processing, I realised that my first thoughts of, yeah, this is a great photo, were right. Now, remember, there's an important thing. There are stunning scenes that will live with you for the rest of your life that simply won't make a great photo. There is a difference between something that makes a great photo and something that has just a stunning scene that you remember. It's an important difference, and it's one of the reasons why when people make prints, they're disappointed sometimes. The prints do encapsulate, for me, an element of the emotion I was feeling at the time, but they're also an attempt to make a picture that somebody else will see something in. You can never know what people see in pictures, but it's part of that. Certainly I have exhibited pictures in the past, and I've seen people stop and just look at pictures and I have no idea what's caught their attention. I'm glad they like it, but I genuinely have no idea what's caught their attention. You can't tell. There's no accounting for what people see in pictures. But anyway, that's the scene. What about actually taking the picture? Well, the most important bit, apart from using decent kit if you intend making big pictures, is the exposure. I will pick an aperture that gives me adequate depth of field, that doesn't stop down too much. So that has varied, depends on the lens, depends on the camera, but it tends to be a relatively small aperture. I'm seriously not that worried about diffraction problems. I want stuff looking sharp. I'm not worried about absolute critical sharpness. That can come sometimes for my architectural photography, which my architectural photography is landscape photography, but of stuff rather than places. The two feed into each other. That's one of the reasons I like doing architectural photography. But there is a degree more precision I take in my landscape photography. Well, actually, the precision goes into the architectural photography because that's where I almost always use a tripod. For almost all my big landscape shots, they're taken handheld. I don't like using tripods for landscape photography. It's always seemed a relic of the 19th century to me. Now, I know a lot of people say you should, and it makes you slow down and stuff like that, but I don't care. To me, landscape photography is of the moment. It's street photography on a big scale. Yes, I can wait for the light, but I'm not into this trekking miles and miles to check out locations and then come back sometime 6 months later to take it. I'll leave that to people who are into that sort of stuff. I'm not. It's probably one of the reasons why digital photography made such a difference to my overall photography. I'm just not got the patience sometimes. I've got darkroom experience. I can probably still make a print, probably still process a film. Haven't got a darkroom anymore, so it's a moot point. But many of those darkroom processes for black and white have come through into actual printing. Right, so I've exposed an image. One thing, I'm always careful not to clip anything where I want detail. I often want detail in highlights, so detail in shadows and that. So I'll expose to make sure that detail is not lost. Now, new cameras have better dynamic range, makes the job easier in some respects in terms of processing the images, but the basics are still there. They haven't really changed. Now, I virtually never use auto. If I'm using auto, it's because I'm at a family event and someone has said, Keith, take some photos. Then, well, they come out how they come out, and I'll trust to the auto in that respect. But for landscape photography use and my architectural use, I shoot almost entirely fully manual. Now, that's helped that I quite often use shift lenses, and shift lenses are manual focus, so you could say in that respect it slows me down a bit. Yeah, great, it slows me down a little bit, but actually after years of practice it doesn't slow me down that much at all. So no autofocus, no auto anything. It's not difficult. If you get the exposure right, and unless the lighting changes, which problem I have here sometimes because there's a wall out of a window here, and depending on the clouds, I can get changes in lighting. So apologies to anyone who's ever bothered by the fact that my videos sometimes fluctuate in level, but yeah, they are what they are. But what I'm doing is I'm looking to take pictures that will make good files for prints. So I shoot raw. I process the raw files and output colour images. Now, I will almost always use a big colour space like ProPhoto because I want as much colour detail in the picture to convert potentially to black and white tonal variations as possible. So if I use ProPhoto, doesn't matter that my monitor may not be able to display all of the detail, all of the colours in a ProPhoto image, really doesn't matter because I'm going to convert it to monochrome anyway. So I'm looking for colour variations that can be shown through as tonal variations because that's all you've got in black and white. Now, one important thing that I found a lot of people don't realise about black and white digital is that the best looking colour photo of your image, of your processed of your file, does not necessarily make the best looking black and white image. It's quite possible that you can adjust the colour, you can do all kinds of tweaks on the colour, and then when you convert that to black and white, you've got a better looking black and white image. Now, you can use all kinds of conversion tools. I've used Silver Effects for years. Don't use it that often, but sometimes it makes a real difference to the look of a picture. And when it comes down to it, it has to be a look that you're happy with. So you're looking at it on your screen, calibrate your monitors, because that affects black and white as well as colour. So I'm looking always to what's going to make the best black and white print. I'm not looking at what looks best partway down through the workflow, what looks best on the screen. I want to know what looks best as a print. A lot of that comes from experience, but I have written a lot about it. So for this particular picture here, I've got a complete work through of the entire process. Now this particular picture, you might be familiar if you've ever used, I have a black and white test image I created, and this picture is part of it. Now the version on this is slightly darker than I normally print. That's because this is to test printers, not necessarily how I want the picture to look. So if you see it in this version here, there is detail in the dark shadow. I've printed this because it's viewed in my home, which is not under bright lighting. I've printed this slightly lighter so that the detail is visible here. Still has the same tonal balance as the picture that's in the test image there, but this is printed to how I want it to look. And that's quite an important thing. So anyway, we've now got our converted raw file, and I'll come back to some elements of raw conversion when I talk about changes and the new tools in a bit. But effectively I've converted the raw file to make a colour file, and I've then converted that to black and white. Now, should I carry on working in colour or black and white? What do I mean here? You can either have your black and white image as a true monochrome single channel image, and I'm using Photoshop here because I've used it for years. Affinity Photo is great. I don't personally much care for Lightroom at all, not for this sort of stuff, but you know, choose what you like. Now you've got the choice. You can have a single channel file which works fine for black and white, or you can have an RGB file of a black and white image. The important thing to note there is that the colour values for the RGB file R equals G equals B. So the three are identical. So it's a monochrome file, but as it is a monochrome image, but in a RGB colour file. Why is that an important distinction? Well, it turns out some processing software and some plugins and tools really don't like handling monochrome single channel images. So sometimes I work in RGB, usually a gamma 2.2 space like Adobe 98, not sRGB, because then Adobe 98 is a gamma 2.2 space, the same as if I have a grayscale file, I'll have that in grey gamma 2.2. That's another one. Ignore all of this stuff if it doesn't mean anything to you. Just stick to Adobe 98 or grey gamma. You can work in whatever works, but I have found some software has issues handling true black and white monochrome single channel files, but you know, that's just a workaround that you'll come across for it. The Canon printer output, for example, the PPL software for printing, has difficulties with black and white files. I don't know why. Canon have admitted that yes, it's a bug in it, but the likelihood of them getting around to fix it is probably quite slim. So there we go, we've converted our image to black and white, and there are loads of ways of doing that. I've got done a video about the basics of black and white conversion, so I won't go into it in any more detail here. So I've got this black and white file. What do I do to it? Well, usually very little. If I've got the good photo to start with, much of the tonality will be there in the picture. I've almost always found that the more you have to force an image, the more work you have to do to get it to work, to look good. Take that as a hint that maybe your original picture wasn't really as great as you thought it was. There is always a problem when you're working on files like this, and I don't use a non-destructive workflow. I start with a file and I work through a process. That's because there's a certain point I may go, I don't like this, and I'll go back to the start. Now, the temptation if you've got a non-destructive workflow is to go back and tweak some element from the start of your workflow and watch it trickle through and see what happens. I don't like that uncertainty. I'm not worried about the essentially sunk costs of my work in producing a version of a picture. I'm sure, and I don't actually have these, I'm sure there are versions of this picture that I produced, worked my way through and thought, this just isn't working. I need to start again using a different technique. Now, this is one of the things you build up with experience. There's no necessarily right way of processing it. It comes with knowing what you want to get to. In other words, knowing where you want to get to with your picture. So simple techniques I might use would be masked curves. Curves are a basic feature of Photoshop and things like Affinity Photo, and they allow you to do adjustments to tonality, and they allow you, by masking, to decide where you want them. You can use them for all kinds of bits and pieces. So as this picture here, I've got the worked example that goes through this particular one. I've used curves to give detail in the sky, and I've used curves to bring out detail in other parts of the picture. It's quite a simple picture to process, was this one. It's not a difficult. I've been back to it, looked at modern tools and things like that, and I really wouldn't change that much of it. And I do go back to this to remind myself that even with a relatively basic file, this is 11 megapixel, remember, a relatively basic file, old Photoshop versions, not doing much, I could do this. And that always reminds me that it really depends an awful lot on the quality of your initial photograph that you took. So there's that one there. There's another picture here. Put that there carefully, since these do have glass in them. These are two pictures which I've got in my sitting room. This one was taken in Colorado. It was on top of Mesa Verde, and there were thunderstorms about. There's a bit of snow. There's a tree. Now, I've tweaked quite a few bits of this using curves just to adjust the overall tonality. I've also used brushing in on masked layers to emphasize aspects like the snow and some of the structures of the trees. This is a burnt tree. There's been a fire here sometime, so there's a lot of burnt stuff around here. We've got a vigorous sky. Obviously, I've processed this sky slightly differently. I've brought up the contrast for the cloud and things there, and in the distance. It started snowing not long after this. Now, this is a classic example for me of how people read stuff into photos. This photograph, I've had all kinds of things read into the meaning behind this. The true meaning behind it is that I had walked uphill a few hundred yards from where I'd parked my car. I was dressed much as I am now. This is at 9,000 feet. There's snow on the ground. At this point, I was realising just how cold it was at 9,000 feet, and also walking a couple of hundred yards if you're not used to it. So this sums up coldness to me, bleakness. This was, my feelings on being at this particular... I've got some great views from where I was here, but this particular one, some colour photos, I've got some nice colour photos as well, but this particular one just sums up a particular scene, particular place I visited. As I say, I've seen people read all kinds of things into it, but almost all the editing that was done on this was done with nothing more than a few simple curves and just brushing in the adjustments. Not much difference to how you would do dodging and burning in the darkroom. Really not that much difference at all for it. So what about printing your images? Which is the whole aim of this, my black and white print workflow. Well, first of all, I'm going to choose, well, I already have a printer, let's say. I'm going to choose my paper. Now, I've done some videos and articles on choosing papers, but a lot depends on the tonal range and how warm you want the picture. This is printed on a cotton rag paper. It's a slightly warm paper, even though it's a cold scene, because I didn't want to have a blue tint to this one. Now, hopefully in the lighting here and the fact that I'm shooting this on a video, this does come across as properly black and white. It is. This was printed with pigment inks. This was on an Epson printer a few years ago. This print's quite old. This was printed on an Epson printer using pigment inks and probably the black and white print mode. Now, I almost always, if there is a black and white print mode, I prefer to use that. I may add a correction for the particular paper choice I've made, but I've covered that in all the different printer reviews I've done. I always look at the black and white mode. So I'm printing the file that I've edited. That may be a monochrome file, it may be an RGB file, but of a monochrome image. I'm printing that. Now, I may add some corrections, and I've done lots of stuff on how you linearize print output. But the whole idea of all that process I'm doing is to make it fairly straightforward, to looking at the image that's on my calibrated monitor, thinking, I know this is going to make a good print. Part of that comes through consistent use of things like this test image to know how a paper is going to look. Different papers look very different. So this picture here, which was actually printed for a local restaurant, printed and mounted on foam board. They paid for it, and then not long after the restaurant went bust. So I've had it sitting around for ages. It's the California coast. I'll cut a version of it into the video because there's just no way this will fit in what I'm shooting here. But I say that has a slight greyish, bluish tint, which I did not want for this. I don't want a cold blue look to it. I want the content of the scene to suggest how it feels for it. As I say, 9,000 feet, dressed broadly like this, feeling rather cold. Now, that simple curves adjustment, if I tried using some more sophisticated tonal adjustment tools in the raw processing or at the black and white conversion, the biggest problem I come across, and this is something that when you see it, you can't unsee it, is halos around objects. If there is one thing puts me off a black and white image, is where there's a tree sticking up and for some reason the tree has got the magic ability to lighten up the sky around it. You get sort of like lollipop looks. You get lampposts. A problem I can have in architectural photography, if you're not careful with the processing goes, is you have a lamppost go up, and where the lamppost goes up, it changes the tonality of the sky behind it. Now that's almost always because somebody has used some local contrast enhancement tool and not seen the halo on the screen. When you print it at a different scale, the visibility of things like halos and stuff like that depends on the scale of the picture. It really does make quite a difference for it. So I'm always very careful. I'm looking for minimal adjustment if possible. Not always possible. Sometimes I do. I may have to tweak areas of a picture more than others. But that always comes back to that caveat. The more work you find yourself doing to make the picture acceptable, the more you should be prepared to say, this ain't working, step back. Now, I've worked on pictures before. I've got nearly there, thought, no, I'm not happy with this. I've left it. I've gone back the next day. I've looked at it and thought, oh, no. Back to the raw file. I know what I don't want. Let's take this route. And that's why the workflow is a route through. It's not something you go back and just tweak this little bit to see what happens here. Now, you may like that approach. It may work for you, but I'm going to say that for myself, being able to go, no, this is wrong, I don't like it, or it's just not working, is an important element of making a print that works. It's that ability to be able to go, yeah, okay, I thought it was a good idea at the time, it just don't work. I've got a lot of pictures which just don't quite work. I never get rid of them because one or two I've gone back to the original file years later, seen something different in it, processed it a different way and come up with a print I like. So never say never. Be prepared to go back, change your workflow. Particularly now, and I'll come back in a minute to some of the changes that I've seen and areas where I'm more flexible in what I change in my workflow. I've mentioned printing using ABD. I've not mentioned sharpening. Now, this is something that has evolved over time. some of my first images printed 20 years ago, I was using unsharp masking, I was using all kinds of tricks like that to try and sharpen up images to get them to print better. You would lose detail in printing. You couldn't send lots of detail to the printer driver. You always had problems with it. Now, big pictures you view from further away. So the actual effect of sharpening is different on different sizes of images, depending on how closely you view them. Now, these are my intermediate level glasses, so that I can read some notes I've put under the camera here to make sure I don't forget stuff. But I can't focus closer than about this close with these particular glasses on. So this print, reasonable distance, it looks sharp. It's 11 megapixels. It's actually, even when I put my reading glasses on, my stronger glasses, it's still sharp. That's because I took care when I was producing it. Sharpening has changed. It has evolved. So I've used Nick Sharpener for years. I've got lots of articles that go back at that way before I did the videos, and it is still relevant. It is still relevant software for image sharpening. Now, we then get through to things like smarter sharpening. Now, things like resizing your image with something like gigapixel AI, which I've covered, looking at how to take small, low megapixel images and make big prints from them. Now, I've looked at that. That's an interesting tool because of the effect it has. And in particular, Sharpen AI from Topaz, which I now use quite a bit on my architectural images, that's the larger architectural images, because it is a smart form of sharpening that lets me use wide shift lenses and not worry too much about some of the loss of image quality towards the edge of the image circle. Now, I am concerned by it, I take note of it, but it's not such an important factor as it was. So I've got lots of reviews and videos covering all of these, so I won't go into the details of this. Suffice to say that my approach to sharpening has probably been the most flexible element of what I've looked at in processing and over the years. So the first image, the one that's on here, this dates back to 2004. This one I think is 2006, 2007. This might be 2008, I'm not sure. These are some old images. I've deliberately picked some old images since they're simple images and they're images taken with relatively low megapixel cameras, and yeah, as far as I'm concerned, they look great prints. So what changes have there been? Just to wrap up on this, what changes have been? Well, raw processing. I now consider doing more in the raw processing. I happen to be using Adobe Camera Raw, the latest version on that. This would be similar if you were using Capture One or something like C1. So raw processing has changed. Sharpening has changed. Now, I have never really believed that three-stage sharpening, that you did sharpening of your raw files, sharpening, creative sharpening, and then print sharpening. To me, sharpening is just one thing. Some parts of an image require sharpening, other parts require no sharpening whatsoever. So for somebody who says, but you must always sharpen your print files and you must always sharpen your raw files, I go, what about this area here in this picture here? All I'll be sharpening is sensor noise. There's nothing to sharpen. Clouds here, I don't really want ultra sharp in the clouds. As long as they look like clouds, I don't mind. Where do I do want sharpening? I want it round here. So that's for the whole image. So yeah, that old thing I say about the three stages of sharpening, etc., etc. Yeah, it had its place 10, 15 years ago. I say move on. Think about why you're actually sharpening and what the purpose is for it. So I might use things like resampling. I might take an image and make it at a much higher resolution using something like gigapixel AI, some sharpening on that, and then find I get a much better overall print. These are the things which are fluid, but the basic process of picking what you want to take the picture of, deciding that it's going to make a good picture and moving ahead from there, they're the important ones. They're the ones that haven't really changed much over the last 20 years for me. Yeah, the details, yes. So yeah, might do more in raw processing now, but you know, how I go about it, they're just a means to an end, and that's the important thing. The black and white workflow is a means to making a print. Now, if I'm showing a picture on a screen, then it's a subtly different workflow. And it's not a black and white print workflow, it is a black and white screen image workflow. The screen is never the print. Prints look different. So, this is a matte paper, the other one's a matte paper. That was a deliberate choice. I might use a gloss paper or a luster paper for some. Less often, I prefer this look, but that's personal taste. Anyway, I will be looking at more aspects of this when I next get a large printer to test. And by large printer, I don't mean the Epson Workforce one that's hiding behind here. I mean a large format printer. I want to look at what do you need to do for making big prints these days? What's the best? 5-6 years ago, I knew what I'd do. I've not had a large printer here to look at for a while, so it's something I want to cover. Anyway, thank you for watching. As I said, please do subscribe to the channel, it's appreciated. And I hope this is of use. Please feel free to ask questions. I'll have links in the notes to this video to lots more aspect articles and other stuff that I've done if you're interested in black and white. And I say, once again, ask questions. They're what give me ideas for stuff like this. So thank you.